Can you hear me? Oh, you can hear me. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see you all today. And I'm so glad you all came to see Jim Coogan. Jim is a Cape Cod author, as you probably know. He was a regular columnist for the Cape Cod Times daily newspaper. Now periodically he does things, and I always love to read them because it's so interesting now that I live on the narrow land. He was raised in Brewster. He's a well-known lecturer on Cape-related subjects. For many years, he taught a popular course of Cape Cod history at the Academy for Lifelong Learning. His most recent book, The Cape Cod Passage, a novel of people and events that have shaped the narrow land, was published in 2022, and there's copies for sale on the back, so you might want to get one before you leave. So he brings a love of the Cape and an eye for storytelling to his programs. Be prepared for an enjoyable talk, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Jim. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You put a lot of pressure on me on a sunny day like this. I was talking to some of the boys in the back there, and the choice was either come to a lecture or play golf. And they made the choice to come, and so now I got to make sure I make it worthwhile for them. It's so nice to be back. I've had a connection to the Academy for many years. I think back around 2001, I started coming up here to the courses, always enjoyed it. And I should mention I have my wife with me, Beth, and she is a past president of the Academy. We also have our therapy dog with us, which, Serena there is the golden, and we're trying to acclimate her to crowds and other groups and things like that. She's done very well. I sometimes wonder, though, whether I'm going to be, able to compete with the dog. She's very popular, I think, than some of the lectures I give. But anyway, it's nice to be back. COVID really did a number. I don't have to remind you that it just really threw a wrench into everything. And I pretty much stopped coming to the Academy, and I'm not a Zoom guy either, so I kind of lost track of everything. And it was nice that the Academy asked me to come in because I get a chance to see people I haven't seen for a long time. And I am hoping that, as we get into the fall and we all feel pretty good and comfortable being all together, that I'll be able to come more often. This is an important part of my life, has been, and I think for both Beth and me, it will be important in the future. As was mentioned, I was raised in Brewster. I don't claim to be a Cape Codder, and I always make that clear at the beginning. My parents brought me down here at age 4 from Boston. And my father was a Boston Irishman, and he was never comfortable here on Cape Cod. I think what happened was that my mother had summered here or come to the Cape before she was married, and when my father lost his job at the Quincy shipyard, she prevailed upon him to move to a town that only had 900 people in it. And again, I don't think he was ever really comfortable in Brewster. He told me once that he went down to the town hall to register to vote, and he walked in and there was an old Capey there by the name of Alpheus Dillingham, I think his last name was. But he was a town clerk. And so Mr. Dillingham said to my father, he said, "What are you going to be?" And my father said, "Well, I'm going to be a Democrat." Well, the guy just dropped off his chair. He said, "We haven't had a Democrat come through town here until the priest did a mission back in 1928. So my father said that, in that very Republican town of 1948, he said that it was about 5 years before they let him sit on the main floor at town meeting. So it was a different world that I got to grow up in. I was very fortunate that way in that it was sort of like a Huckleberry Finn experience. I had 12 students in my class in the elementary school. The school itself, grade 1 through 8, only had about 100 students, so we all knew each other. It's interesting, we just had our 62nd or 3rd reunion, and of the 12 that I grew up with, there were still 8 of them living on Cape Cod. So we traveled, but we came back to the place that I think, meant a lot to us. And even though I'm not a Cape Codder, I feel that, this is really the place that I've really come to love, and I still do. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like studying Cape Cod history and writing about Cape Cod history. It's a very unique place. It's special in so many different ways, and everyone has a particular memory or story that relates to the Cape. And I think it's been my job, certainly for the last 45 years anyway, of collecting these stories and in one way or another writing them. In the last 25 or 30 years, I've been an author, I've been a columnist, I've been a teacher, none of which I trained for, I should say. I never went to school to be a journalist major, and I even didn't go to school to be a teacher. But when I got out of the Navy and I was looking for a job, I always liked school, so I went down to Yarmouth, and where I had gone to high school, and I saw the old department head, and he said, we got a spot that's opening up in the fall. But I said, I haven't had any training. I don't have a certification. He said, that's okay. He said, we can fit you in. And I got in. And, I eventually did get the certification, but it took me a couple of years. But I enjoyed that very much. And I did almost about 30 years teaching high school kids, and I always liked kids. I should mention that, even the last 4 or 5 years, I've been substitute teaching over at Sandwich High School. I live at Sandwich, and I like the kids. And the good thing is, I get to leave at 2 o'clock, and all the teachers have to stay for those meetings, which I hated. So I think, as we were talking at the beginning, once a teacher, you're always a teacher, and I think that's how it works. As was mentioned, I've written a couple of books. Actually, I've written about, I think, the total of 13 books. I have a writing partner that I started out with, Jack Sheedy. He's another Irishman, and he lives in Dennis, and I was living in Dennis for a long time, and we got to know each other, and so we started writing together. And of the 5 or 6 books we've done together, we've sold about 40,000 copies of our books. And Jack has kind of slacked off a little bit. I've been kicking him to write some more, but I've had to do it on my own the last couple of them. But I think I've sold about 30,000 of my own books. And it's, people say, why do you do this? Why do you write? Well, I think it's like anything that whether it be art or music or something that you like to do, I just like to write. And the subject of Cape Cod to me is limitless. There's so many stories, characters, events that every day I learn something new about the place I've lived in for 75 plus years. This latest book that I wrote, called Cape Cod Passage, it's a little unusual in that in the last 2 books I've done, I've started to work writing as novel, historical fiction. And it's a new area for me because I've always been a strict historian. As a teacher, I taught history, and of course when you're a teacher, you're looking at source material, you're looking at getting at the absolute truth, you're looking at footnoting and all that sort of thing. But over the years, it's come clear to me that most people, and I would say 95%, are not interested in history from the academic side. They like the stories, and I'm the same way, and I think that's why I'm a storyteller. I'm reminded of the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and there was a scene in there where the editor of the newspaper, the Shinbone Star, he was talking to some people, and he said, when there's any question about the truth or the legend, print the legend. That's what people want. And so for me, the stories that I get, they're not always true, but they're part of the mythology of the Cape. And I think of it this way: if you were going to teach a class in Greek history, you got to talk about the mythology. It's part of the culture. And just like all the stories that come about Cape Cod, it's part of the whole package. So where do I get some of these stories? They come from all over the place. I mean, I've interviewed people for years. When I was a kid growing up, I would ride my bicycle from the elementary school to my house on Main Street, and I'd always stop at the general store. It was one of 2 stores in the town. It was owned by an old fellow by the name of Donald Doan. And he was a good guy. He was kind of a crotchety guy, but he seemed to like me. And on my way home, I'd stop in there and read all the comic books. He never made me buy one. But there were always these guys sitting in the back, around the stove or whatever, and they'd be talking about things that happened in the past. And I'd listen to them, and I'd get some of these stories, and I'd remember them. And eventually, when I got older, I'd write them down. And like I say, I've talked to people. In one case, about 1980, 81, I interviewed a woman who was over 100 years old. And so her growing up was in the 19th century, and her father was the owner of a whaling ship out of Provincetown. Actually, he owned several of them. And he named his best whaling ship after her, the Carrie Knowles. And in 1903, the Carrie Knowles was lost at sea, and all of its crew were lost. And the story became quite interesting in that about 5 or 6 years later, when everything had kind of settled, one of the crew members' wives was about to be remarried. She had, decided that he had been gone long enough. But then somebody showed up and said, "No, these people are not dead. They're prisoners in Venezuela." Well, anyway, the story got told, and she, wondered what happened to her husband. Well, the whole thing turned out to be a hoax. This person played a trick on the people in Provincetown, and he knew enough about the crew and the ship and the members that the story was believable at first. So this woman, when I interviewed her, she was 100 years old, and she was telling me the story just like it was yesterday. And she did mention the woman's name who was going to be married. It was such a shock. She never did remarry. That whole thing fell through. And it was one of those stories I thought, I got to tell this story, because I'd never really seen it written down anywhere. And so that became one of the stories in the book that I just came out with. Getting sources and stories come from all over the place. My mother was in a nursing home in Brewster for a number of years, and I'd be down there on Fridays and do the bingo games for the folks down there. One time a woman called me over and she said, I got a story for you. And she knew I was interested in the Cape's history. She said, back in World War II, she said, I was a young bride, and my husband was exempt from military service because he was a machinist and he was doing war work. And on the side, he would fix things for people. And one of the things he became very good at was fixing jukeboxes in these saloons in Boston. When the records would not fall, he'd fix it up. Well, he got a call from Provincetown, and people on the outer Cape, their jukeboxes were breaking down, and they wanted him to come all the way out to Provincetown and fix them. Well, the problem was he couldn't get gas because of the rationing, and he said, I don't know if I can do that, but they set it up so that they got him some ration cards so he could get the gas. So he said to the wife, he said, look, let's go down there in August, we'll fix the jukeboxes, I can work on them, you can just go to the beach, we'll get a cottage. They got a cottage right down there, I think it was at Boston Beach. And so she agreed, and they went down there. So he collected jukeboxes in Provincetown, Truro, Wellfleet, and some of the bars down there. And he had them in the cottage, and he set up a couple of sawhorses with some, boards on them to work on the jukeboxes. Well, after, about a week of working on it, he said, hey, we should take a break and we'll go down and have dinner in Orleans. So the two of them got in the car, they drove down to Orleans, had a nice shore dinner down in one of the places in Orleans, I think the Southwood Inn. And on the way back it was pretty foggy, and of course you had to have the lights of the car that they had to be taped. You only see a little light out of them. He wasn't sure where they lived, so he said, I think I got the road here. And he turned right, headed toward the Atlantic, got down a dirt road, and all of a sudden a Coast Guardsman jumped out with a gun and said, what are you doing down here? And the guy says, well, I'm trying to find the cottage. And he said, it's not here. And as a matter of fact, we got some German spies that have been let off a submarine, and they're in this area, and you could be shot if you stay here, get out. And the guy said, okay. They backed up, got up on the main road, and about a half an hour later, they found the property where they had the cottage. And as he got out of the car, he said to the wife, he said, now what a story that is. He said, they probably had a German for 1,000 miles a year. So they went into the cottage, and she said, well, I'm going to go get ready for bed. And he said, okay. And at that point, the wind came up and it hit the side of the cottage, and one of the shutters slapped against the cottage. And one of the jukeboxes started to play a song. Well, he went over there and he looked in the coin container, and there were 3 German coins in there. Now, that's a story that she told me. It was Mrs. McDermott from Fields Corner, Dorchester, and I was just sitting there, this is a great story. Is it really true? She said, yes, it is, and that's a story that is part of Cape Cod's history, and I'm not going to discount it. So I wrote it down in the book, and I think it's a good story, and Mrs. McDermott, wherever you are, I'm telling it now. So those kinds of stories, I think, mean a lot to me, and I think they mean a lot to readers who get a kick out of, what could have been. As I said, as a historian and trained as one and teaching history, I'm always one that, watching for accuracy and, oh my goodness, Serena. Well, anyway, as I said, I've started to move toward historical fiction. And this book, even though it is a history book, is considered fiction because I've had to do some creating. And it was a bit against my grain as a historian, thinking like, am I really a historian? But yes, I am a historian because I'm taking the information and I'm kind of adding something that would make it more interesting to the average reader. 95% of the people are not professional historians, and they want the story, like the editor of the Shinbone Star. They want that. And you can see that when you go to a flea market, you're going to run into books that have been published by university presses and written by PhDs about subjects about history. And you pick them up because you're interested in the topic. But as soon as you get to about the 3rd page, you realize, this is not for me. It's too dry, it's too academic, and it makes me work too hard to get to the material. So I feel that, taking the liberty of creating, using it, the novel approach really works better. Teaching kids all the years I did, I never felt that many kids liked history, and I think that's a kind of a given. They're not going to like history because they're only like 15 years old, and how much do they remember? And how much have they experienced? And so history's kind of a hard sell to young people. And it's a hard sell for older people if they only pick up a PhD thesis research piece. It might be a subject they're interested in, but they never get past page 5. So I think the chance of writing something using the novel approach is a very good one. And I can give you some examples. As someone who loves history, as I always have, I would recommend someone like James Michener's Centennial or Chesapeake. Both of those are novels, but both of those are grounded in the history of the place. And you get the chance to live in that moment that's being described. And yes, there's fiction in there, the creation of dialogue, but it makes the characters and the events more real. And Michener, I think, was one of the best at doing that. Also, if I were to teach the Civil War, I would go to John Jake's North and South. I mean, there he's got a couple of characters that he creates, one a Confederate, the other a Union soldier, North, South, and he gets the interplay of emotions, events, and activities that they had to deal with and that the reality of that time had to deal with. That's where I would go. I'd also recommend something like Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain. You want to look at, a soldier at the end of the war who's returning to his home, everything is devastated. The character is not the real character, but the storyline is real. Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth, The Life of Marie Antoinette. Now you can get a biography, a scholarly piece on Marie Antoinette, but the novel approach in describing the wife of King Louis XVI is a much better approach for the general reader. And I mentioned Mary Renault, The King Must Die. If you're looking at ancient history. She makes it come alive in the novel format. Now, there are some very good non-fiction writers, obviously historians, that can write. And I would say David McCullough, anything that he has written is readable. And I would also mention Eric Larson. If you're not familiar with Larson, Devil in the White City, a couple of other ones that he wrote, Dead Wake, about the loss of the Lusitania. I mean, he's a great historian and a good writer. So, to me, getting the story out and embellishing it somewhat, and I'll admit that, there is creativity there, it appeals to the general reader. Now, once the general reader gets into the topic, then they might want to be more academic and possibly, do something that is a little more challenging than a novel. So when I wrote Cape Cod Passage, my goal was to put a lot of good stories together, but also with historical context, and I also wanted the readers to know that I wasn't just making stuff up. So when you look at the stories, you read the story, and then there's probably just as much in terms of sources and other materials, where I got the information, newspapers, interviews, all of that is listed after the story, so that if I create a character, it has a historical basis. And the only reason in some cases I changed the names of the characters is because some of them are still alive or their families are still around, and I didn't want to embarrass them on a story that might have been a negative one. When you use the novel approach, it does let you create, and I think that's a good thing. For example, I have a story in the book about the loss of the submarine S4. The story began, it was in 1927 in December, and this was a U.S. Navy submarine which was practicing diving operations off Provincetown, and she was run over by a Coast Guard cutter, and the ship went to the bottom 100 feet below. There were 6 men trapped in the forward torpedo room. Now, when you read the history of this whole thing, it's, this is what happened, this is who did that, and this was the end of it. You don't get into the depth of what it must have been like to be trapped in that forward torpedo room in the darkness with your air running out. This is where the historical novel can come into play, because yes, I did create the dialogue between the 6 men. We don't have any dialogue from them, but I could sort of understand or try to create how they felt as their life began to ebb clear to them after about 20 hours that they weren't going to be rescued. That is how I think the historical novel approach works better than straight fiction, nonfiction. Also, you take the example of the loss of the clipper ship Staffordshire. We had a Cape Cod captain, Josiah Richardson was the master of that ship, and she was making a trip back from England to New York, and she ran into a storm and wrecked off of Nova Scotia at Sable Island. Now, the ship went down with the captain. Only a few people were rescued. Most of them were Irish immigrants that were on their way to New York, and they drowned. I did create the dialogue between the first mate and the captain, and I think it makes it more real, the last moments of the Staffordshire, because Richardson was, he was an introspective man. If you've read any of his letters, which I have, at the time, he felt that there was a curse put on that clipper ship, and it had come from 2 women that lived in upstate New York who were spiritualists, the Fox sisters, and they had felt somehow that the Staffordshire was cursed, and they put the story out. A lot of people didn't want to ride on the clipper ship because of the so-called curse, and it began to work on Richardson each time he took his ship out. He went to Australia, he went to San Francisco, but on this particular trip, whatever they had said about the Staffordshire was really on his mind. He wrote a letter home before he left Liverpool to his wife that was on another ship saying, if anything happens to me, this is what you got to do. He had a premonition, and then the ship did hit the rocks and go down. So I was able to kind of create the atmosphere of the loss of that ship the last maybe half an hour before she slid off the rocks and went to the bottom. And I think using the novel approach gave me that opportunity to do it. Slavery. I've tried to cover everything in the Cape's history. A lot of histories are lineal. They go from point A all the way to point D, and they cover stuff in the middle. They don't want to cover controversial things a lot of times, I think. But I feel that all the issues of Cape Cod, whether it be the history of slavery, which is here, discrimination, unemployment, housing, inequality, all of these things are part of the history and part of the contemporary world that we live in on Cape Cod. And so I've put stories related to those topics in this book. As far as slavery goes, I was able to, get some information on slaves that were owned in Truro, and one of them was named Pompey. And I created a story of his difficulties in that he had been brought from Africa as a young man. He remembered Africa, but there was no real chance of him ever escaping. And he, on Sundays, when the other black slaves were able to have a little slack time outside of the church, he would talk to the other blacks who had been born in this country. They had no idea what freedom was. And he talked to them about what is freedom. And the other slaves, they feared it because they said, the master takes care of us, gives us everything. Why do we want freedom? It's dangerous. He tried to explain it and couldn't. So I could kind of put his frustrations into the story of what happened to him. Eventually, he did take a method of escape. And, that's a story that a lot of people have no idea that there were slaves on Cape Cod. But in truth, as early as the 1650s, the Massachusetts Bay Colony legalized slavery in 1646. And it was less than 10 years later that the Plymouth Colony, which included all of the Cape, also legitimized slavery. Initially, it was to enslave Native Americans, but then they began to bring black slaves into the colony and eventually into the Massachusetts Bay when they absorbed Plymouth. These were not like a southern plantation arrangement. This was mostly household servants. But you can go into the probate records of many of the town histories, and you'll see where these people were passed down as property. And most histories, certainly the ones that were written before our time, never mentioned that. They really didn't want to, put a negative on the history of the place where we live. But I feel it should be there. And so I have in one chapter, I think I have about 6 or 7 stories about slaves, escaped slaves. I was able to find a reference that Frederick Douglass was actually in Barnstable in 1842. He had been in Nantucket the year before making speeches, and he made a speech at the Methodist Church in Barnstable about his condition as a slave. And again, this, I think to some people it's kind of new territory because they, it was always the South had the slaves, we freed the slaves, but that's a simplistic look at the whole issue of slavery, and it was here. So I mentioned it. And finally, in the contemporary times, mentioning something like a single mother trying to raise 3 girls in a place that she grew up in, but there's no year-round rentals. And we know the situation. We can read it in the newspapers. The year-round rentals are all being bought up by people that don't live here, and then they rent them in the summertime and they close them up. So a person that's at the lower end of the economy is stuck. And so my own experience was working at one of the state parks in the last couple of years, and I would see families living in tents in July and August because they had no place to live. There were people that were maybe born on the Cape, worked on the Cape, and they had no place to live. So one of the chapters I have is this young woman, and she's facing the problem of what's she going to do with the girls? And she's also in a precarious work situation. So in telling the history of the Cape, and as I say, people and events that have shaped the Cape's history, she's one of them. I did not use a real person in that case because I happen to know 2 or 3 real people in that situation. Didn't want to, put that in there, but that is real history. You could also go to the point of looking at the inequality of the economy here on the Cape. Some have said that, this is, what do they say? I can't really remember, but it's where the young people come to live and the old people come to die because we have nothing in the middle. The middle class is leaving. They can't afford to live here anymore. So we've got a kind of a skewed demography here. And I put some aspects of that, particularly at the high end. I've kind of created a prototypical Nick Mansion owner. And I suppose if you read it, you'll see that I sort of poke some fun at the artificialities of that kind of life and how they have no connection really to real people that live here. And so, I didn't want to just write a lineal history of the same old stuff. And so that makes the book a little bit different. I should mention too that, again, most books are from point A to point F, and they cover it all in between. I've set it up in themes. I have themes related to the earliest period. That would include the geology, how did it form, the early Native Americans that came here, a couple of examples of pilgrims, Quakers that had their difficulties in Sandwich, then eventually moved over to West Falmouth. One of the great stories that I tell, and it's a wonderful one, has to do with a man by the name of Isaac Robinson. And he was the son of John Robinson, who was the leader of the Pilgrims, who did not come to Plymouth. His father, John Robinson, stayed in England, but Isaac came over here as a young man and settled in the Plymouth colony and settled in Barnstable. And when the Quakers came in the 1650s, he was assigned with 3 or 4 other local men from the parish here in Barnstable to go and observe the Quakers because they were doing something they shouldn't do, and that maybe he could convince them that they were on the wrong path. Well, Robinson, he attended the Friends meetings for about 6 months, and at the end of the 6 months, he and the other men filed a report to the parish here in West Barnstable saying, we don't see anything wrong with what these people are doing. There's no reason to harass them. Well, that didn't go well with the authorities in Plymouth, and Robinson and a couple of other fellows were excommunicated. And so here, when you were excommunicated in the colonial period, nobody spoke to you, nobody traded with you. So what was Robinson able to do? He and I think a fellow named Frederick Hatch, they moved to Falmouth, which at that time was uninhabited. They moved in there and set up the town of Falmouth. Well, within about 5 years after they settled in Falmouth, who moves over to West Falmouth? But a lot of the Quakers who were in Sandwich, they moved to the West Falmouth Friends area. And so Robinson gets reconnected with the very people that he had studied and had gone to bat for. And one of the interesting things was that in that time, each town would, the people that lived in the town, the citizens, had to contribute to the minister's pay. Well, the West Falmouth Quakers wouldn't pay because they didn't have ministers and they didn't want to pay for the one that they had in Falmouth. And it was Robinson who sat down with the leadership for the Quakers in West Falmouth and settled the deal and said, it's okay, you don't have to pay the minister's profit or whatever it was called. So, that's a kind of a story that I like to tell because it's based in reality and it also has the interplay of different groups who really had to settle this area and live together. Found by one of the British warship captains. He demanded $4,000 from the town of Brewster, otherwise he'd blow up their salt works. Well, the town, they asked Harwich, they asked Orleans, they asked Dennis, can you help us? And of course they said, no, we got our own business. So Brewster scraped up the $4,000 and paid off so that their salt works wouldn't get wrecked. Well, I heard a story that in the bicentennial 1976, the selectmen of Brewster wrote a letter to the British Parliament wanting the $4,000 back. And I talked to a fellow, Henry Rauschenbach, was a selectman down there, a friend of mine, and he said, you know, we never got a reply back from your opponent. But, you know, those kinds of ties that we have for different periods of time. You know, I've got sailors, writers, artists, lighthouse keepers, Secret Servicemen. The Summer White House, the JFK Hyannis Port White House. Most people know that, but they may not know about Grover Cleveland, who was the 19th century twice elected president, who had one up in Bourne at Grey Gables. Wonderful stories about him. I've read some of the local papers that covered him, and they said, you know, Grover's really a slob. You know, he walks around in old clothes, and people say, you know, you don't look very presidential. And so, you know, Cleveland's responsible. So I'm not president now. I'm like you. I'm vacationing here on Cape Cod. And there's a story that I got out of the Bourne archives where Cleveland liked to sleep in the morning when he was at Grey Gables, which was most of July and August because Washington was shut down, and he was up here. And he was mad because the clam diggers out there that were on the flats out by Grey Gables, they used this steam engine in one lunner that made a lot of noise to blow the mud away from where the clams were. And there were probably about 10 or 50 of them out there every morning, you know, when the tide was low, and they made a lot of noise and woke them up. So he wrote a letter to the Bourne selectmen saying, you know, as a private citizen, I'm trying to enjoy my vacation here at Grey Gables, and these clam diggers are waking me up early in the morning. And you do anything about it? Well, the letter is right in the Bourne archives, and it says, Mr. President, with all due respect, these men are earning a living, and they need to work when the tide is low, and there isn't anything we can do. And the president said, I guess that's it. And so the president of the United States had to take second place to some local clam diggers. So many stories, like there was a fellow up there in Bourne named Emery Ellis, and when the Cape Cod Canal was being built in 1909, I think they started digging a trench, and he was from Bourne, but his family came from Bournedale. And if you know Bournedale really doesn't exist anymore because the canal went right through, and that was the end of the village. Well, all of Emery Ellis's relatives were buried in the Bournedale Cemetery. And so when the ditch was going to be dug, they went up to the cemetery to remove all the graves. Well, his mother was in there, Emery Ellis's mother, and when the surveying and digging party got there, he was there with a shotgun. He said, one more step and you're going to be in the grave too. And they couldn't get him out of there because he had rights, and, you know, there was sympathy for him. But the guy in New York City, August Belmont, who had spent millions getting this thing going, he was very frustrated because he said, you know, I've paid money to the Massachusetts politicians, I've done survey work, I've spent thousands, maybe millions to get this thing done, and one man is holding up the canal. And it was explained to him the situation, and so Belmont said, well, you know, why can't we move them? We've got an undertaker. Well, the advisor said, yeah, but the undertaker's from the North Shore. He comes from Newburyport, and Ellis doesn't want anybody that's not a Cape Codder to take care of his mother's grave. So eventually the whole thing, it was delayed about 6 or 8 months until it was finished in court. And eventually the graves were moved, and they all exist over in the Sagamore Cemetery as you're just going out of Sandwich on the road that goes South Sandwich Road, Sandwich Road. And they're all in there. And so was Emery Ellis. But I thought it was a cool story that one man held up this operation, which is probably the greatest, any kind of a engineering thing that's ever been built in our area. But Emery Ellis did it for about 6 months. Those are the kind of stories that when I get them, they make me chuckle, and I enjoy telling them. A couple more stories that some of them are in the book. I can never remember whether they're in the book or in another book that I've written, but they're good stories and I want to tell them. We had a case in the 1880s that involved a sea captain out of West Dennis, the situation was the West Dennis lighthouse was built in 1855. There was a lot of ship traffic that went, Vineyard Sound, around Chatham, and then around to Boston. There was no Cape Cod Canal, so you had to go that way. That was dangerous, and a lot of shoal water and all. So the government built the West Dennis Light in 1855. Well, in 1880, the government, I guess as a cost-cutting measure, decided they would shut the light down. Well, at that time, there were probably about 6 or 7, seagoing ships, big schooners, 3 or 4 masters that were in Bass River that would travel down to Philadelphia to pick up coal, bring ice down from Maine. A lot of traffic along the coast. And one of the captains was William Garfield, and he had worked out of Bass River for a number of years. He was very upset, as were the other captains. With the light gone, it was pretty tricky going into the channel in the Bass River. So he wrote a letter to a relative. Now, Garfield's people came from Ohio, and in 1880, the new president had just been elected was James Garfield, a cousin of Captain Willie Garfield. So I've seen the letters. They're in the Dennis Historical Society, and he says, we got to get this lighthouse fixed here because it's bad for the mariners. And James Garfield, who wouldn't take office until March of 1881, they didn't do it in January then. So he said, look, I'll get it when I get there, but there's a lot of things I got to get done first when I get down there, but I'll take care of it. So Captain Willie settled back, and he got a letter from the White House in June of 1881, and it was an invitation from President James Garfield to Captain Willie Garfield, his cousin, come down to the White House and have dinner with me. So he got on the train and took his 2 daughters, and they went down. They got a hotel in the Willard down there, and then they went over to the White House and had a dinner. And I've seen the menu. President Garfield was there. He had 2 sons that had dinner with him that night, and an advisor. And kind of an intimate setting. And about 8 o'clock, President Garfield said, Cousin Willie, let's go have a cigar. So they went over to an adjoining room, and as they lit up, President Garfield took out his watch. He said, it's about 8 o'clock, and right now your lighthouse is getting lit back in Cape Cod. He said, I got it done. Well, of course, Captain Garfield was very happy and said, that's a wonderful thing you've done for us. And he said, when you come to the Cape, you make sure that you come to my house and you'll be my guest. Garfield actually had been here in August of 1880, and I've seen a reference in a newspaper that it's called the Cape Cod Item, and he was here for a short time, so he was familiar with the place. Well, anyway, Captain Willie went back to the hotel, and they were getting ready. The next day they were going back to Yarmouth, and they were getting all their luggage ready in the lobby, and people were running through. There was a lot of commotion. They said the president's been shot. President James Garfield was on his way to Baltimore, and he had gone down to the rail station in Washington. He was shot, and obviously great commotion. Well, the long and the short of it is that Garfield lingered in great pain and suffering for about 3 months. Well, being shot now, the way he was, he would have been in and out of the hospital probably in a week. But in those days, the medicine was, they really didn't know what they were doing. They infected the wound. The poor guy, he just suffered, and finally he died in September of 1881 without having done much as president. But I think it was really unique in that one of the few accomplishments of that president was to relight a lighthouse on Cape Cod because his cousin had asked for it. I think that's a story that I like to tell. Another story, and I always like to focus on Cape Cod families. There's my town. If you were a Lincoln or a Doan or a Foster or a Baker, you were one of the original families. You pretty much ran things. At one time, and even when I was a kid, if you were from Nickerson, you were from Chatham. If you were a Baker, you were from South Dennis. If you were a Hinckley, you had to be from Barnstable. You could really identify where people came from then, and that's only like 50, 60 years ago. But, the names of people I've always had a lot of fun with, and the Ellis family is one that I sort of focus on. Patrick Ellis is a selectman in Sandwich, and I kid him a lot about his relatives and their Cape Cod stories, and one story has to do with one of his relatives named Henry Ellis. Henry Ellis was born in Yarmouth in about 1880, and when he was about 20 years old, he went to the Hyannis Normal School, which was where he went to become a teacher. And he graduated from there and he became a teacher. And he learned very quickly that teaching is not an easy game. And he decided that it wasn't for him, and so he went to law school. And he became a very good lawyer. And by the 1920s and 30s, he was one of the top lawyers on Cape Cod, Henry Ellis. He had an office down on Main Street in Hyannis, and he took the tough cases. Well, in the 1930s, nobody really wanted to touch it. And it had to do with the fact that the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, which ran out to Provincetown with the passenger service, they had come through Wellfleet, and they had struck a car and killed 2 people in that car. And the relatives, or the people left behind in that family, wanted to sue the railroad. But the problem was, and why none of the other attorneys on the Cape wanted the cases, there were no witnesses, none. And that'd make a tough case if you're going to try to prosecute. But Henry Ellis was interested in the case, and he did read up about it, and when they heard that he was interested, he got a phone call from Wellfleet. It was a person he knew down there, and the fellow said, "Look, Henry, there was a witness, but he said there's something about the witness. His name is Charlie Bean." Well, everybody knew Charlie Bean. Charlie Bean was one of those people that every town, and my town had one too, sort of an odd character. He's been described, I think, as a couple of sandwiches short of a picnic, you know. He wasn't all there, and all towns had them. They were celebrated, actually. It was in an age that we don't live in, where back then they didn't have social services that would try to make you normal. You know, they let you alone, and Charlie Bean was a character. Well, Henry Ellis wasn't too sure about how he could depend on Charlie Bean, but he figured, I'll go down to Wellfleet and check it out. So he went down there, and he met Charlie. Charlie was sitting out front of the town hall, and Henry said, "Charlie, what did you see? What was it like?" And Charlie Bean said, "Oh, Mr. Ellis, it was something awful. It was terrible." He said, "The train came through and hit the car, and the people died, and the bell didn't ring, and the whistle didn't blow." Well, you know, being a smart lawyer, Henry said, "No, tell me that again." And so he told the story. He said, "The bell didn't ring and the whistle didn't blow." Okay. Now, Charlie, I'm going to bring you to, as a witness down to Barnstable Superior Court. I want you to remember what you just told me. Now, Charlie had never even been any further up Cape than Orleans, you know, so going to Barnstable was a big deal. Anyway, the day of the trial came, and Charlie was in the witness stand, and Mr. Ellis went up, Attorney Ellis went up, and he said, "What is your name?" And Charlie said, "My name is Charlie Bean, and the whistle didn't blow and the bell didn't ring." The next question was, "Well, Mr. Bean, where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Wellfleet. The whistle didn't blow and the bell didn't ring." "What do you do in Wellfleet?" "I deliver mail and do small jobs, but the whistle didn't blow and the bell didn't ring." Well, he said this for about 28 questions, you know. This was, and by, you know, the 20th question, the jury was in stitches. The defense lawyer didn't even bother to cross-examine him, and the award was made. The people who survived got the money, and the New York Haven Railroad had to pay. And on the way home, Henry took Charlie to the Howard Johnsons down at the intersection of Route 28 and Orleans, and that was probably the first time he'd ever had one of the 28 flavors. So, and it was a good story, and you know, one of those stories that I just think I need to tell. Being a sunny day, and those chairs don't look all that comfortable, I'm not going to tell too many more. Maybe 2 more I think I can think of that I think would be good. And, you know, I could write a book probably, and there have been books written about Provincetown, and there are some great stories about Provincetown. One of the ones I really like has to do with Eugene O'Neill. And early part of the 20th century, 1914, 15, 16, a lot of people who were very creative, the Bohemian crowd from Greenwich Village, discovered Provincetown. Now, in 1915, Provincetown was pretty much a conservative town, a majority down there, mostly fishermen. But these people from New York City hit Provincetown, and like I had never seen anything like it before. There was Susan Glaspell, who was a very well-known author. Edna St. Millay, Vincent Millay was out there. Jack Reed, who was a noted socialist, eventually, participated in the Russian Revolution. George Cram Cook. There were a lot of these people that were very creative. They lived a very different lifestyle. I imagine the people in Provincetown, probably wondered what was that all about in the East End there. But anyway, about 1915, I think Eugene O'Neill showed up. He wasn't known really. He hadn't really written anything important. But he joined the Provincetown Players, and they began to put on plays on one of the wharfs out there. And one of the first plays that was put on was a play called Bounties for Cardiff, which was written by O'Neill, and it started on the wharf. It was pretty successful, and he began to write more. Well, while he was in Provincetown, he stayed in Provincetown, and he actually lived there a good part of the year, for probably about 4 or 5 years. And he always wanted to get things out of the Provincetown Library. But there was a librarian there named Abby Putnam, and she hated him. First of all, he was a drinker, and he would show up drunk a lot of times, and he was abusive, and he was a New Yorker. I mean, what can I say? Actually, he was from Connecticut. But, she didn't like him at all. She, when the New York Times came in, she made sure everybody else got it before he did. Wouldn't let him take out a book because he wasn't a resident, couldn't get a library card. Just gave him a hard time. He hated her, too. Well, he wrote a play called Beyond the Horizon, which got the Pulitzer Prize. And so the following spring, he was back in Provincetown. He went to the library figuring that now he was somebody. But she threw him out again, and said, "You're just the same old drunk, and, don't bother me." And the hatred continued. Well, a couple of years later, he wrote the play called Desire Under the Elms. It's a famous play. Most of his work is very dark. I think it reflects the personality of the writer. But this play had a younger woman who seduced, she married this farmer, and then she seduced the farmer's son, and then she had a child which she killed, and she was a pretty nasty woman. And when it came to picking the name of the woman, it was Abby Putnam. And he used that name, and I always consider that his revenge for all the time he never got to read the New York Times. But, these kinds of stories. I mean, again, Provincetown is just a wealth of stories. Well, let me finish with one story. It has to do with a fellow in Barnstable. His name was Hinckley. And he was a farmer, and he lived over near Osterville. And he was a young man, and like most Cape Codders back, probably beginning of the 20th century, he was a man on the move. He bought some land, became a farmer. He did cranberries in the fall, and he had an oyster bed off Osterville Beach down Craigsville Way. It was pretty successful. So he courted another woman from Barnstable. Her name was Mary Burgess, and eventually they married, and they had a couple of children. Things were going pretty good, and during the 1920s they prospered, and they were in good shape. But then the 1930s came, and the Depression hit. People weren't buying the oysters. The cranberries were not so good. There was a blight that year on the cranberries, and there was a hurricane, and it blew down his barn. A couple of his animals died. And in the spring, Mary, his wife, was helping him with the plowing. She fell off the plow and broke her leg. She was no good for working. And then scarlet fever hit the family, and the boys got sick. They had to quarantine the house. It was bad. And he was sitting in his kitchen one morning, and he was thinking to himself, he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And he got an idea. He decided he would write a letter to God. So he wrote a letter to God. He said, Dear God, I'm having a hard time here on Cape Cod. Kids are sick. Wife's got a broken leg. Economy's down. I need at least $1,000 to get through this year. If there's any way that you can help me, God, I'd be really appreciative. You know, I'll be at church every Sunday afterwards. And he put it in an envelope, and he addressed it to God. He had his return address on the back, on the front. And he took it down to the Osterville post office and put it in the little slot. Well, the postmaster knew Mr. Hinckley, and he didn't have the heart to really say, no, this isn't going anywhere. So he just sent it on to the Centerville post office. Well, they got a kick out of it, and they sent it to the Hyannis post office. Well, it made its rounds. After about 30 days, it ended up in Washington, D.C., at the dead letter office there. And down in the basement, there was a, level 1 government employee sorting the mail, and he came across the letter to God, and he was obviously intrigued, so he opened the letter up and he read the letter from Mr. Hinckley. And he was very moved by it. And he thought, God, this poor guy up in Cape Cod, all this stuff is happening to him. So he went up to the next level where were all these people in booths, and he said, look, I know it's tough, he said, but if you could help this guy out, can you contribute something? I'll put a hat out here, and maybe you can drop some change or something in it. Well, at the end of the day, he had $750. So he converted it into paper money, and he put it in an envelope, and he sent it back to Mr. Hinckley because he had the return address on there. Well, about a month later, another letter came through the dead letter office addressed to God, and there was Hinckley's name on the back. So, and then the little government guy got the letter. And what is this? He opened it up, and he said, Dear God, I really appreciate your trying to answer my letter. He said, but you know what? Those damn crooks in Washington took $250 out of it. Okay. Now, with that kind of a story, it's probably time to get out and enjoy the day. One of these books, which I have probably more than I should have, they're discounted. A $10 bill will get you the book, and it's signed, and I'll come back to the back. But again, I hope to see a lot more of you as I kind of re-enter the ALL phase, and Beth will do the same, I think. So we're happy to be here, and thanks so much for being a good audience. Thanks a lot.